Hello, everybody, and welcome to Envision IT's first webinar of the year. Hope you guys have had a good start to the year. We've been having a ton of conversations with customers around SharePoint migrations. As I'm sure you've seen, the announcements coming out around the end of support have garnered a lot of attention. So we thought we'd bring our team together, pull together some best practices around preparing for migration, and use this as a way to answer any questions that you might have. So we're going to have two people with us today, actually a few members from our team, but Peter Carson's going to be delivering some content for you. And we're going to be doing some Q&A with one of our project managers, and we've got some technical staff here as well. Peter, do you want to give yourself a quick intro?
Sure. Peter Carson here, president and founder of Envision IT. Also a longtime Microsoft MVP, looking to heading out to Redmond next month for the annual MVP Summit, chatting with all the product engineering folks at Microsoft, and always enjoy doing these webinars as well as conference events through there. We're going to be sharing the deck and the recording, so you'll have links for email and LinkedIn and all that from there. I'll pass it over to Mark from here.
Thanks, Peter. Mark Campbell. I'm a senior consultant with Envision IT, been with the company for about 18 years and a little over 20 years in the SharePoint world. Of course, love working with Microsoft 365. Specialize mostly in getting the most out of the out-of-the-box features. Thanks.
All right. So just a few housekeeping things before we get going. We are in a listen-only mode, so the participants are muted. The chat is open throughout the webinar, so feel free to ask questions as we go out. We'll be answering them through here. We will do a bit of a live Q&A. You should notice at the top of the panel, there is a Q&A section, so you can put your questions there. There's also a chat, so if you need any of our attention, put something into the chat and we'll address that for you. And this will be recorded and made available for you within 24 hours. So with that, welcome.
Actually, Kevin, just to be full transparency here, actually recorded the next section that we're going to be doing for the main bulk ahead. I'm traveling, so I'm actually in Bangkok late at night tonight. So I figured, you know what, I'm not going to depend on the internet and have it work on that perspective. Let's just have it play out from there. So Kevin, if you want to just go ahead and roll from there, and we'll dive right into the main content. All right, let's dive right into things. I always like to start with a bit of a spoiler alert, a couple of key takeaways that we're going to circle back to at the end of the session as well. So first and foremost, extended support is ending this July 2026 for both SharePoint 2016 and 2019. We're going to talk about what that means and what your options are. But don't worry, SharePoint migrations are manageable with the right process and tools. We're going to take you through what that looks like. At the same time, migration time is time for some house cleaning as well. You know, you can lift and shift and just bring it right across as is. But I think the better approach is to think about how you want to structure and architect your content in SharePoint Online, which is probably different than how you did it in your on-premise servers. So let's do a quick overview of the agenda that we're going to cover off today. We're going to talk about the end of support impacts for 2016, 2019, just sort of set the stage as to why we're here. Then we're going to dive into the types of migration scenarios, go through the different things that you may see or may have in your environment, maybe some of them, maybe all of them, and how you deal with each of those individually. Then we'll go through the migration process, talk about tools for migration, and do some wrap-up, closing, and Q&A. As Kevin mentioned, we're going to have the chat open, so feel free to ask questions as we go through. But I'm going to blast right through the content here, and then we'll break at the very end to take questions from there. Okay, so this July 14th day that's coming up, what does that mean? If you're on older versions, SharePoint 2010, 2013, I mean, the ship sailed quite a while ago from a support point of view. SharePoint Server 2013 ended its extended support in 2023. Extended is basically sort of the absolute latest date that Microsoft will support you from that perspective. 2016, 2019 are both arriving at the same time. Usually they stagger them out. It's usually 5 years after the end of mainstream support, but they've actually decided to end the extended support for both 2016 and 2019 this July. If you're on SharePoint Server Subscription Edition, assuming that you patch regularly and keep it up to date, there is no fixed end date, so you're fine on that side there. But I would argue there's still a strong argument for moving to SharePoint Online. So let's talk about, beyond that extended support, what are some of the reasons you'd want to move across? And probably the biggest is just total cost of ownership. Running your own SharePoint farm, whether that's physical servers that you have in your own private data center, or you're hosting it up in Azure VMs, the capital and infrastructure costs are quite high for that. There's a lot of servers that you need to run. There's licensing around that in terms of server license and client access license. I know that Microsoft 365 licensing grants you some of the licenses that you need to run your on-premise farm, but not all of them. So there is definitely costs there. Probably the bigger one is IT staffing costs. You basically have to do everything. You're on tap to keep it running, to patch it, to deal with security, compliance, and that's a full-time job. There's a lot of work involved in that. And honestly, that's probably one of the biggest drivers that we've seen. We're doing a number of migration projects right now for clients moving off of on-premises into the cloud. And that's probably one of the bigger drivers. In fact, one of them, had some cyber incidents that really pushed the needle on that one. I think that was what sort of tipped them over and said, hey, we need to get off our on-premises and into the cloud, because that whole security and compliance is critical these days, and Microsoft doesn't take care of all of it. There's things you still need to do in the cloud point of view, but they take care of a lot of it. So it's definitely better from that perspective. Scalability-wise, if your needs grow and your requirements grow, you need to expand that on-premises infrastructure. SharePoint Online just grows with that. It can get pricey as well if you get beyond, say, your tenant allocations in terms of your storage. Buying additional storage can get expensive, but there's solutions to that as well from an archiving and retention and disposal perspective. So, if you do have heavy compliance, data sovereignty, you got a lot of customizations, there might be an argument to stay on SharePoint Subscription Edition on premises. But even then, I don't think it's valuable from there. You don't get the innovation, the mobility, the AI support that you get in SharePoint Online. And on that data sovereignty, data residency, this has been a blocker for a long time for a lot of organizations. Microsoft addressed it actually quite a while ago in terms of getting certifications for the public cloud in Canada. So on the left are all the various Microsoft 365 apps, on the right more of the Power Platform side. It's not a comprehensive list. I kind of did a little bit of co-piloting and researched myself to say, okay, which are the ones that are residency in Canada? Some of the things in the past, like Power BI, were not resident in Canada when data sovereignty first came up and the data centers first opened in Canada, but Microsoft has since addressed that. The bolded ones on the left are the ones that we really care about from a Microsoft 365 point of view. And even from a sensitivity point of view, Microsoft globally has a ton of certifications from both governments and certification bodies. Government of Canada has certified the public cloud for both Protected A and Protected B assets. What that means, Protected B, if you're a commercial organization, that likely is going to cover everything that you have. It covers personal health information, personal credit information, all that high sensitivity information would be fine at the level that's provided by Protected B. It's only when you get to Protected C, confidential, secret, top secret, these are national security types of things. So unless you're CSIS, Department of Defense, or a private contractor that's working with those organizations, you're probably not dealing with content at that level of sensitivity. So for most of our clients, there's no issue at all in terms of the sensitivity of the content in there. And then probably the other biggest driver for us is there's a ton of interest in AI, of course, over the last year, 2 years. Copilot's been taking off. We've been doing a lot of Copilot pilots for our clients. If that data is not in the cloud, if Copilot can't see it, it's not going to be able to answer questions about that. So if all your content lives in file shares on premises or in your on-premise SharePoint servers, you can jump through hoops to get Microsoft Search to crawl that content and to make it available in Copilot. The better approach, honestly, is to just move that content into Microsoft 365. It just makes it a lot easier. Okay, so let's dive into migration scenarios. And I kind of see three buckets of scenarios that we want to talk about today. The first is classic publishing intranets. So you've got your corporate intranet, your staff portal that all your staff come into, and you've built it on SharePoint on premises. And we still see these. We've still got clients running that. In fact, one of the migration projects that we've got going on right now is moving a classic intranet into the cloud. They're actually going to keep it as classic. I'm going to talk about some of the concerns with that, but it is an option in there. And then we've got documents and records, and this is probably where the biggest volume of content is. You often have terabytes of content, if not more, in organizations, file shares, or on-premise SharePoint servers. How do you move that into the cloud, and what does that look like? And the last piece is customizations. Because you managed the SharePoint farms in the on-premise world, you are able to do whatever you want with that. There's lots of things you can do on those servers to tweak and customize them to get them to work the way that you want them to work. Microsoft 365 is a multi-tenant application, so that means that many organizations share the same servers, and Microsoft's never going to let you run your own code on their servers from there. So how do you deal with those customizations is something that you need to think about in there as well. But let's dive in a little deeper into the classic publishing intranet. So you want to move your staff portal into SharePoint Online. And as I mentioned, it is possible to move it what's called classic to classic. So if you've got an older SharePoint 2013, 2016 classic intranet that you invested a lot into building, you could lift that right into the cloud. But there are some significant caveats around that. You do need to enable classic sites in SharePoint Online. That support is deprecated, but still available, which means that Microsoft may remove it altogether at any point. You don't really get yourself into a future safe spot by moving into classic in the cloud. You should really be doing what's called a classic to modern intranet. And fundamentally, this is a rebuild of the intranet. It does generally require full stakeholder engagement and design process around that. So if your desire to get off on premises is driven by the IT department, and maybe they don't want to engage with HR and communications and kind of open up the can of worms of what the intranet should be, I could see why they might push for doing a classic to classic, but ultimately the organization is going to benefit by going through that process. It is a good opportunity to refresh and update that content. Odds are that internet was built 5-10 years ago in SharePoint on premises. It probably doesn't reflect the needs of the organization today. So it is a good time to do some house cleaning and tidy that up. I put a link down at the bottom here to a Microsoft note about the classic sites. So let's just pop that open because it is very confusing. In fact, we still have a lack of consensus here at Envision IT on what Microsoft is actually trying to say here, because they rule a bunch of things. There's custom scripting, which they really don't want you to do in SharePoint Online, but they do allow it. So you need to be able to turn that on if you want to use it. The classic publishing sites creation is a different thing that you can turn on. By default, it's not there, so you have to run some PowerShell to turn that on. And you'll notice down here, this is the important piece here, the custom scripting changes will retire starting March 15th, which is only just over a month away from now. So after that point in time, you won't even have the option to opt out. You won't be able to do custom scripting in your sites from there. But this allows classic publishing site creation. The way I read it, at least, is that that will still be part of the all other commands that are expected to remain functional beyond the date, but I wouldn't count on it for long term. They're going to want to retire classic sites as well, so it's really not a great approach to focus on. Okay, so that's your intranet, and can be very important to the organization. Can represent the spot, sort of the one place that all staff go to find information, policies, events, news, things like that. There's a real opportunity there to improve by bringing it over into the modern site. Now let's switch to the next scenario, though, documents and records. So you've got millions of documents and terabytes of storage in on-premise SharePoint servers or even file shares. How do you move that across into SharePoint Online? And much like the internet scenario, there's sort of two approaches here. One is that you just keep the structure that you had there. You just migrate those site collections as is and bring them into SharePoint Online. Maybe those are classic team sites in on-premise. Classic team sites, again, still supported for now, but probably not long-term through there. And you can do some categorization to say, do we need to move all of the content in there? You kind of decide, what are we going to migrate? What are we going to archive? And what should we just delete and not bring across? Because again, it's time for doing some housekeeping through there. And should we be maintaining or updating permissions? Often permissions over time become a mess, and this is actually a good opportunity to tidy that up as well. There's also the issue around subsites. They're still supported in SharePoint Online. They're sort of an old school way of doing information architecture back in the early on-premise days. Microsoft's been recommending against it for some time now. So again, do you want to flatten those subsite structures into their own site collections as part of this? You need to decide what your new information architecture looks like. But just like with the publishing sites, I think this is a good opportunity to think about a modern information architecture. We often call it a teams first information architecture. Pretty much any organization that's using Microsoft 365 is heavily invested in Microsoft Teams as well. They may not have a formal Teams IA. They may just use group chat and meetings and things like that. But there's a good opportunity to say, hey, how should we structure teams in our organization? What should this look like? And at this point, it's not so much categorizing site collections and migrating those across. It's really focusing at the content itself and saying, hey, we're not going to worry about what the old structure looked like. We're going to decide what the new information architecture should look like, and then we're going to go through a mapping process to target that content in. You still make the same decisions around what am I migrating, what am I archiving, what am I deleting, but you're going to provision new sites and teams with your new information architecture and then migrate that content into that. So actually, let's flip for a second here. I've got Mind Manager, which is a tool that we use for information architecture. It's a little bit small to see on the screen here. This is basically the Envision IT Microsoft 365. So you can see these green boxes are our teams. It doesn't show all of them, it shows a lot of them. We've got our development, our management, our marketing, operations, sales, so sort of standard department level teams. Now, Envision IT is both a professional services consulting organization and an independent software vendor. So we build software products, including our tenant dashboard that we're going to talk a fair bit about today. But we also do projects for clients. So having a structure for our clients is important. We first rolled Teams out in 2018. So we're coming up on 8 years now that we've been using Teams. And decisions that we made 8 years ago kind of come back to bite us now in 2026, because we decided, hey, we're going to create a team for every client that we have, and we're going to create channels for every project. And what that did over the years is blew up into hundreds and hundreds of teams with thousands of channels underneath them for a company of 24 people. And it just didn't make sense. It was overwhelming looking at it from that point of view. So we said, hey, let's build a new client template that's not a team, and we're just going to have channels for each client and then a Microsoft 365 group site for each client with its own structure in here where we can keep our legal agreements, our invoices, any of the private documents that we don't want to share with clients. Because ultimately, most of the content that's in our client sites, we actually openly share. We're very transparent with our clients. All of our projects, our quotes, recordings, things like that, OneNote, are all shared with our clients. And I'll show you in a minute what that looks like through there. So that's sort of a decision to be made is, again, are we going to lift and shift across? Sometimes that makes sense. Or we're going to do a re-architecture as part of it. This is a good time to do it, because if you don't do it now, odds are you're going to have to do it later as part of reorganizing your Microsoft 365. We've done those projects as well. We've taken larger organizations and completely restructured their Microsoft 365 because they rolled Teams out through COVID, and it got a little out of hand and Wild West, and then it's time to tidy it up. So you might as well tackle it now as part of the migration. The last piece is the trickiest. These are customizations. So like I said before, there's a lot of customizations you can do with SharePoint on premises because you own that infrastructure. You can run whatever code you want on those servers. So often we saw a lot of custom branding, particularly with intranets. And when you're looking at moving that to a modern intranet, our recommendations to our clients is stick with the modern branding guidelines. They used to be pretty limited. Microsoft's actually opened up a lot more you can do around fonts and styles and colors and things like that. But at the end of the day, we used to get asked by clients, can you build an intranet for us on SharePoint that doesn't look like SharePoint? And I think that's less of a concern now, to say, you know what, we just want a great intranet. And Microsoft, kudos to them, has done an awesome job at giving you the tools to build a really strong modern intranet. There used to be a lot of vendors that had intranets in a box that, you know, you add a custom product onto your SharePoint farm and then build your intranet on that to let you do all the things you wanted to do. I think that ship has pretty much sailed. Those days are gone for the most part. And Microsoft out of the box lets you do pretty much what you want to do from there. We still build, you know, SharePoint Framework web parts and things like that for custom pieces within that, but it's much less than what we would have done in the past on premises. Which kind of leads me into the second point here, full trust solutions. What that means is code that you've built that's going to run on the SharePoint server, and Microsoft's never going to let you run that in their public cloud. So you've got to rebuild that. There's no if, ands, or buts around that. And typically that means rebuilding it in SharePoint Framework, which is a open source but supported by Microsoft framework for building extensions, not just to SharePoint, but to Teams and other parts of Microsoft 365 as well. And it's quite mature. I was actually doing a little more chatting with Copilot, prepping for this to say, when did SPFX first come out? I've been a Microsoft MVP since 2011. Every March, in fact, I'm looking forward to next month heading out to Seattle, spending a week with the product engineering group. And they share a lot of information under private NDA with MVPs from around the world of where they're going. Back in 2016, they shared this new thing called SPFX. They actually launched it the next year in 2017. And we were a little skeptical because they had gone through a lot of different passes on how you should customize SharePoint. There was sandbox solutions, there was full trust solutions, you know, there was a number of different approaches. And it felt like every year or two, they'd say, hey, throw it that way that we told you to do it before. We have a new way through there. So of course, when they announced SPFX, we're like, oh, is this the flavor of the year? And 2 years from now, there'll be something else. Fast forward, I guess, 9 years from 2017, SPFX is still very core and very much the way that customizations are done, not just for SharePoint Online, but for lots of Microsoft 365. So kudos to Microsoft. They've built a good framework and structure there, and they've stuck with it and just continue to extend and expand on it. InfoPath forms. InfoPath is a product came out in, I don't remember if it was 2001 or 2003, but it's 20 plus years that it's been around. And Microsoft's tried to kill it quite a few times. It's like the zombie product. It's, you know, not really an official product, but it still exists and you can still run InfoPath forms to a certain degree in SharePoint Online. Microsoft really doesn't want you to. So we would never recommend moving InfoPath forms from on-premise into the cloud and keeping them as InfoPath. This is your opportunity to rebuild those. This can be a daunting process. We have clients with literally hundreds of forms, and it's a lot of work to rebuild that. Sometimes there's simple forms, and you can just use a SharePoint list or loop to rebuild that, and you actually have a lot more control to customize the input forms on those. There's a lot you can do there. But more complex forms, you may need to use SharePoint Framework and build your own solution. You could use Power Apps from the Power Platform side of things. There's lots of third-party software. Nintex has been around for years. Webcon, others that provide forms tool. Lightning Tools is another one. So you know, there's a number of commercial products to consider as part of that as well. And it may not be a one-size-fits-all. You may have sort of different pieces that address different forms that you have. But again, I would strongly encourage you to move off of InfoPath and use a modern platform for those. And kind of related to that, I mean, typically when you have a form, there's usually some sort of workflow behind that. Somebody submits the form, who gets notified, what business process does it go through? And SharePoint Workflows was a common way to do that. They did exist in SharePoint Online, but Microsoft has deprecated them, so they're no longer supported. So really those need to be rebuilt as well. Power Automate and Logic Apps are sort of the obvious ones there. Power Automate if you're more citizen developer focused, so you've got folks within the business that want to build the workflows themselves. Power Automate empowers them to do that. Logic Apps, we tend to prefer it's more enterprise grade. You can do proper source control and environments and such around that. So it's a little more robust from a workflow point of view, but more professional developer type of level. But again, there's third-party software that can help with that side too. So lots of options on the customization side. There's no one size fits all. This really becomes a discussion to say, hey, what have you got going there? What needs to continue to function versus what could just be shut down? And what's the best way to address each of those? You kind of have to go through it item by item and determine what your path forward is there. Okay, so let's dive into process. And process goes through a number of steps, and it may go through multiple cycles where you say, hey, let's only focus on part of it, get all the way through the migration and change management around that, and then move to the next, or you may look at the organization as a whole. It depends both on how big a job that is and whether you need to break it up into bite-sized chunks, or whether it's better just to rip the band-aid off and do it all at once. But it starts out by doing an inventory. You got to know what you're dealing with. So how do you inventory the content that's in your on-premises SharePoint? Planning out your information architecture, ideally you're not just doing a lift and shift, you're planning for modern architecture. So figure out what that looks like, which kind of leads to the next point of teams and sites provisioning. How do you build out that information architecture in Microsoft 365? Then do your mapping to say, hey, we've got this old structure here. We've identified what we're migrating, what we're archiving, what we're deleting, but the stuff that we're migrating, how do we organize it into our new information architecture? And that's something you really need to involve the business in, to go through and catalog and make decisions around that. And then there's the actual migration. We're going to talk about different tools for doing the migration. And change management is not the end of this. Change management kind of goes through the entire process. You got to, talk about what you're planning on doing and what the impact is going to be to the business before you start, as you're working, and after you're finished. So it's very much through the entire process. So I mentioned briefly about a tool called the tenant dashboard. This is something we've created at Envision IT as a SaaS product that sits on top of Microsoft 365. But we're now starting to use it in migration projects as well. You can see on the left, it will inventory what's in your SharePoint Online, OneDrive, Teams automatically. It's built to do that. But we can also run PowerShell scripts and pull content in from SharePoint on-premise services or from file shares and bring that into the tenant dashboard as well. So you can start to look at all of your content all together to say, hey, what's my total set of content across what I already have in the cloud, plus what I'm planning on moving in, and then start to do some categorization and decisions around that. So you can surface that up in the tenant dashboard. And then it has a bidirectional connection to Excel that lets you categorize it and make decisions around content in there. So we're going to go into that in a second. What I want to do first is talk about information architecture a bit more. So I shared the MindJet, which created this diagram here, and we've got the client site template over on the right-hand side. So we've got lots of clients, and basically we want each client's site in our Microsoft 365 to look the same. So as you move from project to project, you're not trying to figure out, which senior consultant was PMing this project and how did they like to organize things. No, it's organized in a consistent fashion so that people can find things easily in there. And as I mentioned, we expose those client sites out to the clients themselves and makes it easy for them to collaborate and interact with us through there. Okay, so let's come over to our tenant dashboard here. Bear with me a sec. So if I go to portal.envisionit.com, this is where you would come if you were using the tenant dashboard yourself. You would log in with your organization's identity. We're actually using our Extranet User Manager product to run this. So we're using guest access into our tenant to let you come in and see your dashboard. So I'm going to log in here. My screen is a little overwhelming because we've got lots of client sites here. It's going to show up all of those mixed in. Let me just scroll quickly down here into tenant dashboard. There we go. And this is an admin interface. It's not intended for your end users to be using. It's more for an IT administrator that's going to be planning out the tenant. So it's got a bunch of details of when the last crawl ran. So it ran a couple of days ago. When the next schedule is rescheduled every 5 days. We can do on-demand runs as part of that. Who did the consent of the application? Because it is a multi-tenant app. You have to consent into your tenant to allow it to collect the metadata. We're not gathering your content. We're gathering metadata about your content. So if I click on the view report here, it's going to fire up Power BI for me. I don't need a Power BI license. We're actually using Power BI embedded, also part of our product. So it allows me to see the Power BI dashboard without requiring my own Power BI license. Let me just flip this over into full screen view here. So this is actually our production Envision IT tenant, and we're in the process of doing tidy up and clean up. I mentioned that we built a new information architecture, and we're in the process of migrating that from our old structure. So if I look at the workspace category here, we've got client sites, we've got Envision IT sites, we've got some temporary demos, but this blue one here, the migrate one, that's sites. So we've got 30 Microsoft Teams and 7 team sites that we've targeted to say, hey, those are our old structure. We don't want Teams for all of those. We're going to collapse them into Microsoft Team sites, not Teams. And we can see, we've got 6,000 documents, about 144 gig worth of content in there. We've got a bunch of sharing links. They're all set with an action to migrate. We've got a little bit of sensitivity labeling using Purview on that. We can make that as part of the migration process to say, hey, we really should have labels on all of our workspaces going forward. So let's make sure we do that as we drill in through there. And I can drill deeper into this to say, hey, I want to drill through into the workspace list, for example. And I can see all these dash old sites. We've basically renamed the sites to old because we're going to create new workspaces with the new structure, and we're going to migrate the content through here. So we're not actually doing an on-premises migration, but the concepts are the same. So it was a good example to use with that. As we can see here, I can see how much storage is used in each of those, how many documents that are in there, what's the total document size, what sort of sharing, numbers of members, sharing links, owners, etc. We've got a lot of information that was collected from the tenant as part of that. Okay. So the first step, building out that new information architecture, is to actually provision all the new sites. So we've got 37 sites there in an old structure. We need to create new ones. How do we go about doing that? So part of the tenant dashboard and actually part of our EUF product, we took what we had built a couple of years ago with open source teams and site provisioning and rolled it into our products. It's fairly simple. It's not as sophisticated as some of the commercial products that we've used from partners like Orchestry and Vine Tuning, but for our purposes here, it works quite well. It basically takes an Excel input file through some PowerShell and provisions those sites over in Microsoft 365. So actually, if I pull one of these Excels open here, let me grab that. Sorry, I've got too many Excels open. There we go. So this is basically the work list to say, hey, we've got actually only about 31 in here. I think some of them were already created, site collections that we need to create, and we want to create them as modern team sites with a Microsoft 365 group, and we don't actually want to create a team as part of that, and we want to apply our template to that. So this is using what's called PNP, which is the Microsoft Patterns and Practices. It's also an open source group at Microsoft that's built a lot of tools around development for not just SharePoint, but Teams and other Microsoft products as part of that. One of the things it does is it lets you template a site and then create new sites with that. So if I come back to my browser for a second here, go to the dashboard, and let's just go to our home site. And I'm going to go to our template client. So this is a site that we've created just through the regular UI of SharePoint Online. We've added in a couple of lists that we want in here. We've set up the web parts on the homepage the way we want it. We actually use some PNP search web parts for things like links and featured documents. And we have our own extranet user manager web part in here that allows us to manage members, including external guests, that have access into this site. So we get this site the way that we want it, and then we populate the Excel here to say, hey, I want to create 31 more sites that look just like that. And it basically takes a snapshot of that existing site that we've tailored the way we want it, creates a new modern team site. So back in January, we created those sites and applies the template to it. There's also a lot of other decisions we can make on that. Do we want to associate it with a hub site? Do we want to apply a Purview sensitivity label to that? Yes. Where do we want to set the privacy? We don't want to create a team. What sort of external sharing? In fact, a lot of this external sharing stuff is actually overridden by the Purview label. So that actually drives that on there. So you can see there's a lot of control you have around setting this all up. And you just basically run that PowerShell script, and it'll run through and create each of these in sequence through there. That'll include all the web parts that I was showing you on there. And then it calls out to a Logic App workflow at the end of that has our own product pieces in there that creates an EOM group that lets you manage the users in there and ties that all together as part of that. So we can then go and create all of those site collections. Okay, so next step is the mapping. So our old site collection structure was built around teams and that we'd have channels for projects. We don't want that going forward. We want to flatten a lot of that. So how do we go ahead and do that mapping? Well, what we need to do is come back into Excel here. And this is another part of the tenant dashboard. What it does is in tenant dashboard, we've read every single document that's in your tenant. And if you've imported in external things like an inventory of your SharePoint servers on premise or your file shares, it has all of that content as well. Basically, this Excel calls out to tenant dashboard and pulls back the unique folder URLs for each of the sites. In this case, I've grouped it down to the category of migration. So we've got, if I scroll to the left here, a bunch of those dash old sites that we're mapping through as part of this. And I've done a couple of them to give you a sense of how it hangs together and what it looks like. So basically, the decision process here is, let's actually take this first one as an example. So this site is Municipality of Chatham-Kent. We've done a number of projects over the years for them, including some SharePoint upgrades. I think we've got another one going because they're still running SharePoint Server 2019. It's going to be ending in a number of months from there. So these rows here are all related to that Chatham-Kent client team. And we want to shut the team down and just focus on having groups for that. So we've got to map things across. So I have to look at these and say, okay, what does this content represent? So I can see here, if I highlight all the rows, we've got 385 documents in their team, totaling about 2.2 gig worth of content. So I need to figure out where to put all of that content. So this is where having a subject matter expert is important, because they got to make decisions around that. I can look at that and say, I know we did an Azure public website infrastructure project for them. So that particular folder represents a project. So I'm going to, in our new structure, we've got a projects folder that we want to drop that into. I'm just going to copy that there. This general is just a couple documents that are sitting in the top of the general channel in Teams. Let's just throw them at the root of the shared documents library. We'll figure out later what to do with those. And then we've got the general invoices. So those ones I'm going to want to put in shared documents. We've got two columns here. What I'm doing is I'm mapping this across to say, take this invoices folder that's under general right now and just push it up to the top and put it under shared documents. So there'll be a shared documents invoices when we're done. The subfolders underneath that, I'm just going to leave them blank. The process will take care of that from there. Then we've got private documents here. So this is the one area that we don't share with clients. So if we've got budgets under review and things like that, we can work on them in here. And when we're ready to share them, we can go in and share them. So we've got budgets, we've got business development. Again, I've got some subpaths for some RFPs in there. I'm not going to worry about that. We've got this confidential folder. Let's drop that in. And we've got our private documents quotes. Let's drop that in there as well. And then as we come up here, these are the quotes we've actually shared with the client. So we're going to leave those up at the shared documents level. Again, I don't need to worry about the subfolders. And we share all the recordings with our clients. So let's put that in there. And then publisher POC, that looks like another project. So I'll drop that in there. SharePoint 2013 needs assessment with all of its subfolders. Public website upgrade, let's do that. And 2019 farm implementation. Okay. So it took a minute or two, but I've gone through that whole client, those couple hundred documents, and decided where to put that. You'll notice there's a bunch of blanks in there. So there's some Power Query behind this Excel. So I can come to my data tab and just hit refresh on that, and it'll do a bunch of calculations, and it'll say, hey, these subfolders belong under the top one from there. So it'll map out all of my target folders through here. And what we can do from this is dump this out as a CSV, and basically we use that out of the mapping process to go into the migration process. I'm going to talk about different tools. ShareGate is kind of our preferred favorite tool from a migration vendor. They're a fellow Canadian company. They've been in business for a long time, and their tools just work really well. So we can take that Excel mapping that I just went through there. One of the things you can do with ShareGate is rather than clicking through the UI to do migrations, you can actually drive it through PowerShell. So the PowerShell can take the CSV from that mapping that we just did, and it'll drive ShareGate, pull the content in from the file shares, from SharePoint on-premises, or even from somewhere else in your SharePoint Online tenant, and push it to where it's supposed to be in Microsoft 365. It'll keep all the metadata, the file modified, the owners. If you've got richer metadata in your SharePoint on-premise farm, all of that will come through as part of that. Now, some things you need to think about. This slide here I actually pulled from a deck that I did 2 or 3 years ago. So the numbers may have changed, but I think they're probably still pretty similar there. So ShareGate uses some APIs that Microsoft provides for doing high throughput migration, because normally Microsoft would throttle you if you tried to put a lot of content through. But they can typically get about 1 to 2 gig per hour through a single SharePoint VM up into SharePoint Online. I'm going to talk about Zillia in a minute. They can get to higher rates. It's a more complex tool. But the important thing is to make sure that the tools you're using are close to or ideally in the same Azure data center as the Microsoft 365 that you're migrating to. We did a big migration about 5 years ago now for a large insurance company. It was a massive on-premise IBM Content Manager records repository. There was about 35 million documents, about 15 terabytes of content. So there's a lot of stuff to move across. If we ran one machine, 15 is 7 times that. It would be basically a year to migrate that content across. So we actually used 15 VMs and brought the throughput up because it basically scales well through that, and brought that time down significantly. We can also do pre-migrations where you say, hey, let's migrate all the content now, and then maybe 2 weeks from now when we're ready to do the real migration, ShareGate has an incremental mode where it'll look and see, well, what hasn't changed in the last 2 weeks, and just leave it alone. It's already migrated, and that can really shorten your cutover time from there. So if 90+% of your content can be pre-migrated, you can get a lot done in a complete weekend. So when we started that large records migration project, we'd worked with the business, and the business agreed. They had 4 business units geographically across Canada, and we were going to do them one at a time and spread it over 4 weeks or 8 weeks through there. And then partway through the project, they said, you know what, it's just going to be tough from a change management point of view because claims go across regions and things are going to get messy. We'd rather just do a cold turkey, bring it all across as part of that. And it took a couple months to get ready, to do all the planning, to do the pre-migration of content. But that entire system, the 15 terabytes, 35 million documents, we shut the business down end of day Friday, 5 p.m. on a Friday, said, hey, don't touch any of the claims that are in there. Or if you have to, keep a record of it because they're not going to get caught as part of the migration process. And by Sunday afternoon, we had a go, no go decision with the client to say, hey, has user acceptance testing happened? Is everything good to go? We've done multiple runs and multiple UAT beforehand, so it was much more straightforward through there. Did the go decision Monday morning, 1,000 staff across the country came in and started using SharePoint Online from there. And there was no rolling back. Everything hung together and worked really well. So it took a lot of planning for something of that scale, but it's absolutely achievable through there. So, you do need to think about, are we doing a full migration? Are we going to do multiple migrations? Often we see department level migrations to say, hey, let's deal with everything for a single department or a small group of 2 or 3 departments, get them done, and then move on to the next one, particularly with file shares, because often those file shares are department focused anyways. And rather than trying to do everything at once, it works a little better to do it as multiple migrations. So again, it depends on the client. And then, of course, change management. I mentioned before, super important before, during, and after. Make sure you're doing training. Make sure you're doing user acceptance testing. It's really important to keep your business community up to date with what's happening. What are the important dates? When is content getting frozen and migrated, and when it's going to be available again to be used from there? Make sure you're very clear and consistent with your communications around that. So I mentioned migration tools, ShareGate and Zilio being two that I'd mentioned, ShareGate really being our preferred. Zilio, we did a fair bit of looking at working with them, but we actually haven't done a client project with them. So I haven't gone all the way in through there. There is a free from Microsoft SharePoint migration tool. The honest truth is we've tried it a number of times and always hitting a brick wall where it just gets in the way and we end up back at ShareGate. So we tend to just go straight to ShareGate on every migrate project. You can also use OneDrive. I mean, it's sort of a poor man's migration tool, but it can actually work pretty well. Basically, you can sync a local copy of all your sites and folders to your local PC. So you can do sort of a sync from SharePoint on premises, for example, and that will retain the modified date, which is probably the most important piece of metadata through there. It won't retain any other metadata if you have others through there. But basically, you can then sync to your SharePoint Online and copy those or move those files into that sync folder, and then the OneDrive sync client will push them up into the cloud from there. So if you've got a smaller set of content, it can work well. It could be used for file share migrations, but honestly, we tend to use ShareGate for the file share migrations as well. So that's kind of our preferred. I mean, the migration tools I mentioned, haven't had great success in that. Can't particularly recommend that. ShareGate, we love, it works really well. So that's our go-to. Zilio, has a more complex solution. If you've got a really complex migration that maybe involves different source systems. So that big one I was talking about with the insurance company and the IBM content manager system, if we'd known about Zilio then, we might have looked at using it as part of that because it was a more complex migration. Did I cover off all the pieces here? So we did the file migrations, the client sites. I guess the one thing I didn't show you coming back to the tenant dashboard was how I did the categorization in the dashboard itself. So if we come back to this page here, and I come back to my main workspaces view, how did I populate things like the workspace category and the workspace actions through here? It's all driven through another Excel as well. So this Excel is basically the tenant dashboard Excel. It syncs all the data out of the tenant dashboard. So what are all my workspaces, my OneDrives, libraries, even users, and then you can go in and categorize. You can set actions like I want to migrate this. You can see a number of different actions. Hey, I want to clear broken permissions or I want to clear sharing links. So this is useful just for house cleaning on your tenant as a whole. There's a lot you can do through here. When you save this Excel, the next time the Power BI refreshes, it'll pull all these decisions in, and that's where you'll see them in things like this here, which really helps with breaking that apart. You could have categories by departments and say, let's go department by department and sort of take it in bite-sized chunks through there. That allows you to do that. Okay, so just wrapping up from closing, coming back to the key takeaways that we mentioned at the beginning, that the end of support is coming, that the SharePoint migrations are very manageable. Get the right process, get the right tools, get the right partners, and we're happy to work with you to help you do those migrations. That's a big part of what we do. And bear in mind, it's time for some house cleaning as part of that. Don't just lift what you have and shift it into SharePoint Online. Do some tidy up and clean up as part of that. On the tenant dashboard side, there's a link here. We're going to be sharing the recording and the deck. So there's a 30-day full feature trial. There's no limits on that. Have a look at your tenant and go through there. If you want to use it against your SharePoint on premises or your file shares, let us know because we've got separate PowerShell scripts that we use to run those inventories and then feed that data into the tenant dashboard. It's all self-service to set it up. You can buy it from us. You can actually buy it from the Azure Marketplace as well. And then last note here, on the modern internet side, as I mentioned, if you've got a classic internet site, this is your opportunity to update it and upgrade it and make it modern. I'm actually going to be heading to New Zealand in a week or so, presenting at Digital Workplace Conference down in Christchurch on modern internets, and then I'm going to do the same talk as a webinar in March timeframe when I'm back in Canada. So with that, I want to say thank you for everybody joining in, and we can take a minute to have a look through the questions and follow up from there. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, thank you to Peter for putting that together for us. Like I said, we did record it because we weren't sure if his internet was going to be 100% stable where he is, but it is as close to live as we could get. I'm looking at the Q&A. I don't see any direct questions yet. And I like to say, if there's no questions, we've done our job perfectly. But I'm sure there are some questions that you guys have. Mark, I'm kind of curious, how long does a typical migration take?
Well, that depends. It really depends on how much content there is, and how much cleanup has to happen. It's really difficult. We've done migrations in a matter of weeks, and we've had migrations. I had a migration project, which actually was just a reorganization in Microsoft 365, take almost a year. So there really is no simple answer to that question.
Yeah, so it can take a short time, it can take a long time. I think probably sounds like if people have to do this, they should start getting on it. What would you say, like you've done a number of these projects, what's one or two mistakes that customers typically run into when they start doing these?
That's a good question. Trying to go too fast would be one. Planning is key. Really understanding your data and understanding how it's structured and what you want it to look like once it's in 365 is key. So I wouldn't dive headfirst and say we want to migrate. We want this done really quickly. Let's just fire up ShareGate and get going. Other mistakes? I don't know. It's a good question. I honestly, I'd have to sort of give that a bit more thought, I think.
Yeah,
I guess engaging the business themselves as well. I mean, sometimes these migrations are very IT led. IT just wants to shut those servers down and sort of dam the torpedoes full steam ahead. But it is the opportunity to not just do some house cleaning, but some reorganization, and that can't just be driven by IT. You do need the input from the business as part of that.
Yeah, good point.
Mm. What do you find customers tend to get surprised by?
That's a good question.
Volume of content and duplicates and oversharing, all permissions, just how messy things really are is maybe not a surprise to some folks, but others it definitely is.
Yeah, I guess once you start looking under the covers of what you actually have, you start to see just how cluttered it can actually be.
Yeah, and that can feel overwhelming to say, hey, you've got 35 million documents. We'd like you to categorize and organize them. Like nobody wants to hear that, but you got to get it into bite-sized chunks that people can manage.
Yeah. How do you decide what not to migrate over?
Ultimately, I mean, this comes.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, ultimately, I think that's a business decision. You have to be careful because I think one of the initial, inclinations is, well, we need everything, and that's almost never the case. So it's really making those decisions, and again, I like Peter's point about these things often tend to be IT led, but they're really business processes. So it's up to the business to answer those questions and make the hard-hitting decisions, I think.
I mean, it can drive some other good policy changes like Microsoft Purview from a compliance point of view to say, hey, we know we should be doing something about retention, which doesn't just mean how long are we supposed to keep this, but also we're supposed to get rid of it after that. And a lot of organizations haven't done that. So, thinking about what is our retention strategy. I mean, I was looking at just those 30 odd client sites that we have there and the couple gig of content just for those in there. The vast majority of that was meeting recordings, just from a size point of view, and started me thinking, okay, I know that if recordings are just in my OneDrive, they automatically are only retained for 30 days and then discarded. We move them into client side so clients can access them and we can retain them for longer. But do we really need to go back to a recording from 6 years ago and watch what we said? It's actually not that useful. So, that is a classic example of cleanup. And lots of clients are hitting this where they're running out of SharePoint storage space, and it's not cheap to buy more from Microsoft. So this is a good opportunity to deal with that.
Got it. One thing I kind of took away from this is, some of our clients have a fair amount of technical debt and how they've built it before. How do clients prevent future technical debt?
I mean, a lot of that is stay in the box. Like, branding. Don't try and make your SharePoint intranet not look like SharePoint. It's not that bad that it looks like SharePoint. You can build a very visually rich intranet and stay within the box. And that's just going to make your life so much easier from a future maintenance and an upgrade point of view. I mean, yes, upgrades are evergreen in the cloud. They happen all the time. But if you go too far into your own in custom, then something's going to break later when Microsoft changes things. So try and avoid that in advance.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the advantages of SharePoint Online, that it's a lot more user-friendly when it comes to customizations and branding, things like that.
Yes.
And there's so many more tools that are available now than when we were in the on-premise days with all of the, the Power Automate, as I think Peter alluded to earlier, is kind of a citizen developer tool where if you've got a little bit of smarts and a little bit of know-how, you can create some pretty powerful workflows. And the various different form options from Microsoft Forms to actually fairly recently they've rolled out some new form options right on SharePoint lists within the last year or so, I think, that just make it, for me, and doing intranets and collaboration portals, some of these form options are game changers because users can do it on their own. They don't need to approach IT.
Excellent. Well, without going too far down the future path, because that's going to be the topic of our next webinar, we're going to go into detail about what a modern intranet is and what kind of capabilities you get, and how you can use that to really kind of transform what your intranet is today. So we'll be scheduling the date for that very shortly. It'll be early March, I expect. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, if you guys do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can actually reach out to us through Teams in this chat channel if you want, or set up a call with Logan. We'll get you in touch with Mark or somebody else to go through and answer any questions that you have. As I said, the recording will be up tomorrow, so you can go back and review this. And as always, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed today's session.